All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started here? The classic album of the week for this week, in honor of the 9/11 remembrance, is "Born in the USA," 1984 album. Bruce Springsteen. How many have at least heard "Born in the USA"? Okay. All right. So 1984. So it's a little later than I normally choose, but it seemed to sort of fit, fit the times here. There's "Dancing in the Street." "Dancing in the Dark" is one of the other tunes in here. I don't know. I didn't listen to it a lot. I did buy it though. All right. I actually have a chapter. I finished the chapter on majority rule, which we're going into. So when you look in the textbook subfolder, you'll see that I have a chapter on majority rule. Again, there's probably some typos and things like that, but I put that in there. Again, also the note, I had put in a prior year the notes in there, so the handwritten notes are in there as well. All right. So last time we said that Buchanan and Tulloch had picked up on this idea of there's two types of costs when coming to make a decision, right? There was the Vixel was trying to eliminate that external cost, that is the cost of the majority it's imposing on the minority, but also then there's this big transactions cost, right? So he was going to say, well, how about if we have unanimity on the tax and the expenditure part, but then coming to a decision might be really difficult. So Buchanan and Tulloch sort of picked up on this idea, and they said, well, let's think about what the optimal majority ought to be if we're going to vote, right? Should we have a 2/3 vote? I mean, if you notice in the filibuster situation, what do you got to have? You have to have 60 votes in the Senate, right? There are certain things that will require a 2/3 vote of both houses in order to pass. So, but other things, just a 50% majority, right? Reconciliation bills only require a majority. You can't filibuster a reconciliation bill, and so the picture that would tell that story, we said, was that if we're going from 0%, which is the dictator, and we have 100%, right, which is unanimity, then what we would see is that the external costs might be certainly higher when there's a dictator and they go down to 0, right, if you have unanimity. So if we were to draw the external cost here, and then the transactions cost would go the other way, right? There's no transactions cost with a dictator, but then there's higher and higher transactions costs as we go for unanimity. And then the idea is that you want to find that the optimal majority is, we'll call that Q star here. The optimal majority is where you minimize the sum of the two. So in the calculus of consent, here's what we have is Buchanan and Tulloch. What do they want? They say, okay, we choose that majority that minimizes the sum of those two decision-making costs. And that sort of makes sense in that if you had something that has a really high external cost, then you ought to move yourself towards the unanimity. Again, there are some things that require a 2/3 vote of both houses. What do you have to have what's the amount that you have to ratify a constitutional amendment, right? Yeah, 3/4, okay? So it must be that there's a higher possibility of a external cost going on there. So you're going to move yourself towards a higher percentage. And if you have something where there's low external costs, but there's really high transactions costs, then you'd be moving yourself more this direction. Now, what do we find? We find that in a large majority of cases, there is a simple majority, right? I mean, if I said to you all, we're going to vote on it, and I didn't say, hey, we're going to need a 2/3 vote or, something like that. If I just said we're going to vote on it, what would you guys expect? You'd probably mean that, okay, if the majority wins, we're going to do it. But question is, why does that happen, right? Why do we often get where the sum of those two costs tend to fall right around 50%? And the reason is that there is a distinct drop in transactions costs once you get to 50%, right? So if you have transactions costs, if you're less than 50%, turns out they'd be high. And why would that? Suppose you had to have a 30% majority. So I go, okay, I got to have a 30% majority. So then we have a bill that comes up and it says we're going to increase educational spending. Okay, so we're in the state legislature, state house and state senate, they're voting, and you got to have a 30% majority for it to pass. So this bill to increase educational spending, let's say it passes with 35%. So the 65% would be opposed, but it passes because we put 35%. Now we have another bill. We're going to reduce educational spending. By 10%. Okay? So then it passes with 40%. Well, you can see that's going to goof up, right? If you have less than 50%, I could have just the opposite of one bill pass and then pass just the opposite. I could increase taxes with 35% and then decrease taxes with 40%. So you'd have a really high transactions cost in trying to come to a decision. So basically what Buchanan and Tulloch noted was that there's a discontinuity, right? There's a discontinuity in the transactions costs at 50%. So if we were to draw that picture, and we go from 0% or dictator up to 100% unanimity, what do we end up with here? We say, okay, the transactions costs might be real high here, and then, so this is our transactions cost. And then when you get to 50%, there's a big drop in the transactions costs. So then it goes like that. And then if we just had our regular old externality costs, it might look like this. You're going to have a total cost that's up here, right? And then it's going to drop. It's going to have this sudden drop in it, and so that the total cost would be like that. So that's just a picture that's telling the story that says, if you have a less than 50% majority, why do we end up with this 50% majority as the general rule? And the reason that you do is because there's this sudden drop in the transactions cost that happens at 50%. And so you will never go you know, I don't think you'll ever see a situation where, oh yeah, if 30% vote for it, it happens. Okay, so that explains why we have this 50% majority. All right. So any questions on that? Yeah.
So we're only considering cost in this graph, which seems like it's leaving out benefits. So like, for example, it may be like higher transaction costs at like a 70% majority, but you may also have greater benefit from like stopping more bad policies and stuff like that. So
well, but stopping more bad policies is saying there's an external cost on somebody else, right? That's the bad. What are we talking? We're saying that what's a bad policy, right? We can't say you know, Arrow's impossibility theorem just told us that you can't really say, oh, this is a bad policy for America. What you're talking about is say, well, what your benefit that you're talking about is really the reduction in the external costs that's happening along here. So there's a reduction in the external costs as we go along there. All right, so let's now then move on to the next section where we're going to talk about the median voter. And there turns out there's going to be cycling problems that, but what we're going to do, and again, we've now moved into Holcomb Chapter 5, okay? So if you're going through the syllabus, Holcomb now has some discussion in here, okay? Again, I've got the notes for you, and I've just put the chapter from the textbook that Dave Hebert and I are writing in the textbook folder, but the Holcomb also has a discussion here on this. There's a median voter, and we're going to find out that there's cycling problems if you just have majority vote. There was a Holcomb book sitting up there all last couple days. Somebody got that? Did they pick that up? No? Oh, it was sitting right over there. I just noticed for the last few days. So if you've lost your Holcomb book, it's floating around here in the classroom. All right. So the issue here is if you think that voters will vote for things which are closer to them, then we can voters that vote for things that are closer to their preference, to their highest preference, right? So if their highest preference is $500,000 in spending on fixing the lead water pipes in St. Joe or Benton Harbor, well then they'll choose 400,000 over 200,000. So they're going to vote for the thing that's closest to their preference. So if they vote for the things that are closest to their preference, what's going to in a simple majority vote, what's going to happen is that the median's voter determines the outcome. So if what we're going to do is we're just going to have a vote on how much the Congress is going to spend on something, or what we as the Hillsdale Praxis Club, how much we're going to spend on whatever vote, whether we have people come in or have a party or whatever. If we were to sort of draw that picture, if what we did was we put people's utility up here, and we had a single issue space, let's say this. So let's say this. Well, the amount of a government good that we're going to spend. And again, they're talking about, they've got lead water pipe problems, or lead in the water problems in Benton Harbor. And so they want to spend a certain amount of money to fix that up. So let's say the legislature is voting on how much to do that, and you have person one, their preferences look like this, okay? So person one's utility, we'll call that U1, so that you will have UI as the utility of person I. So if person one is here, U2 is there, U3 is there, U4 is there, and U5 is there. So you have 5 people. And what we're saying is that we'll let G here be the amount that you're going to spend on government spending on this particular government good. Well, we've made this so that everybody has a higher utility for things that are closer to their preference, right? This is the amount that the person one would most prefer. This would be the amount that person two would prefer. This is the amount that person three would prefer. We'll call this 1, 2, and then 4, and then 5. So everybody, we've said everybody's voting for something. They prefer things which are closer to what their most preferred amount is. Well, if you just think about it for a minute, then notice that what's going to happen is that if we start out at 3, well, let's start out at 1. So let's say we start at 1. Well, if you start at 1 and we have a vote, should we increase the amount that we're going to spend, right? If we started at 1, person 1 will vote to stay there, but 2, 3, 4, and 5 will vote to increase. Right? So if we have an alternative that says, okay, we're going to spend more, let's say pick 2, 4 people would vote to move this direction. If we're at 2, what are you going to get? At 2, what's going to happen? 3, 4, and 5 will increase. Now you get to 3, right? This is what we're calling the median, right? What's the median? Half are to one side and half to the other side, right? That's what the median is. So if we look at the median and we get to the median voters outcome, 3, if you try to increase, what's going to happen? 1, 2, 3, vote no, right? 4 and 5 would vote to increase, but 1, 2, and 3 would all vote because they're moving farther away from what their preferences are. 1, 2, and 3 would all vote against it. So similarly, if you started out over here at 5, right, and you said we're going to reduce it from 5, what would happen? 4 people would vote against it as you're moving. 4 people would vote to reduce the amount, right? Person 5 would vote against it. If we were at 4, 1, 2, and 3 would all vote to reduce it. Once you're at 3 and you try to go farther to the left, majority is going to vote against it, okay? So what's going to happen here is that the median voter's preference will be the outcome. So if we assume that people vote for things that are closest to their preference, you don't have an all or nothing, right? I either want to spend $700 billion on national defense, or I don't want to spend anything on national defense, right? I'd rather spend nothing than 400. If you're not going to spend 700 billion, it's not enough. So forget it. I don't want, let's just not spend. Well, then that's not going to fit this, right? This says we're going to reference this in a moment, what do we say? We say that they're single peak preferences. Right? Single peak preferences. We're saying, okay, I can't, I'm going to vote for things that are closest to my preference. Now, Condorcet, who we've already talked about before, right, back in the 18th century, he noticed that, yeah, there could be a problem with this. And in particular, if you have majority vote, and we say, okay, we're just going to let people vote, you could have cycling. You could have intransitivity. So you get an intransitivity. Now, if all I do is have majority vote, and we say, we're going to have, here's what we're going to do. We're going to just have simple majority rule in the Michigan House and the Michigan Senate. That's the way we're going to do it. Well, what's the problem? I'll just give you an example here. Suppose that what you have is you have 7 voters, and let's say that you have 3 alternatives. And those alternatives are going to be the status quo. That is, we don't do anything from what we're doing. We have a motion, and then we have an amended motion. So if I have 3 types of voters, and let's say they look like this. Type 1, Type 2, and we'll have Type 3. And let's say Type 1, here's their preferences. So this is how the ranking that they're going to do. They'd like the status quo first. That's what they prefer. Then they prefer the motion, and then they prefer the amended motion. And let's say there are 3 of these people. Okay, so Type 1 voters, they have they don't want anything to pass. The motion would be their second favorite thing, and then the amended motion. Let's say Type 2 has the motion, and then they prefer the motion and then the amended motion, and their least preferred is the status quo, and let's say there's 2 of those. And then for Type 3, you have an amended motion, you have the status quo, and then you have the motion. And so there's 2 of those voters. Well, turns out if you sort of think about it, you could get an intransitivity. Remember, one of the things that, one of the characteristics that Arrow had suggested that you need for a social welfare function is that transitivity seems like a normal thing to have, right? We assume that individuals are transitive in their thinking. So if we go to the status quo versus the motion, okay? So if we've got the status quo against the motion, Type 1 voters will vote for that, right? So we got 3 Type 1 voters. The Type 2 voters, they want the status quo the least, so they would vote for the motion. So we got 3 that pick the status quo, and then we have 2 that pick the motion, and then we've got these Type 3 voters, right? They're going to pick the status quo over the motion. So we got 2 that'll pick the status quo. This is Type 1. Type 2, Type 3. And so what's going to happen? 5 to 2, the status quo is going to beat the motion. Okay? Now what we'll do is say, oh, okay, let's do the motion against the amended motion. So we're going to do the motion against the amended motion. Well, again, what's going to happen is it's going to win 5-2. Type 1s are going to vote for the motion against the amended motion. Type 2s are going to vote for the motion against the amended motion. So that's going to win 5-2. Okay. Well, if we were to be transitive, we have the status quo beats the motion beats the amended motion, so the status quo ought to beat the amended motion if you were going to have transitivity. But obviously, we didn't set this up randomly. It's going to turn out that that's not going to happen. If you look at the amended motion against the status quo, these guys would vote for the status quo, right? These guys would vote for the amended motion over the status quo, and these guys are going to vote for the amended motion over the status quo. And so the amended motion is going to beat the status quo 4-3, right? So you have this intransitivity. I mean, that's the big deal here. Is this thing is not transitive. So simple majority rule, depending on what people's preferences look like, right? Simple majority rule can result in a cycling problem or an intransitivity problem. So what does that mean? Well, just an obvious thing is that the order of the vote will determine the outcome, right? If I get to choose whether we're going to vote against the amended motion and the motion first, and then vote for that winner over the status quo, I can get a different result than if what we do is you vote for the status quo and then the motion, and then we allow you to do amendments to the motion. How many have ever heard of Robert's Rules of Order? Okay, yeah. Robert's Rules of Order is this, okay, here's the order in which you do stuff, right? So if you, if you're, I don't know if Praxis has a committee or something that votes on stuff, right? What will happen? You say, okay, we're going to start out with the motion, and we're going to vote again. We're going to start out with a motion on the floor, and then what's going to happen? Then you can offer amendments to the motion, and then whatever wins, then you vote on that. Okay? So what are you doing? You're setting up the order of the vote, saying that I'm going to compare the motion with the amended motion, and then the winner of that is going to go against the status quo. So the order of the vote can affect the outcome if it's intransitive. And so what happens then is that the committee chair can determine what what's called the chairman. If you're ever in the legislature, there's a thing called the chairman's mark. Okay, so the chairman decides, hey, you go to the chairman and he says, okay, or she says, you can include this part in the bill. I've got this bill. Well, before we go to the Legislative Service Bureau and have the bill drafted, let's figure out what's going to be in the bill to start with. So you could affect with this what's called the chairman's mark. You can affect what's going to be in the motion and what's going to have to be in the amended motion. So the rules of voting will determine the outcome. Now, you could also notice that basically whoever sets the rules, right, can affect what the outcome is. And what do you want to do, right? You always want to be in the majority, right? That's because if you're in the majority, what happens? You have all the committee chairs. And so the committee chairs can effectively affect what bills come before are offered before the committee, et cetera. All right, so let's think about this for a minute. What if you were a type 2 voter? Okay. And if you're a type 2 voter, you could well, we're going to, when we get into game theory, we're going to talk about looking forward and reasoning back. And what would happen is you could vote for the amended motion over the motion. So you don't really want the, you really prefer the motion to the amended motion, but you vote for the amended motion over the motion, and if you end up doing that, then what's going to happen is that's going to beat the status quo. And you would prefer the status quo is your least preferred. So by flipping, what's going to happen is you're going to make it so that the amended motion wins, which is better than what you wanted to do with the status quo. Okay? So I got an incentive to misreveal my, just as we talked before about when we were talking about the ranking of football teams and how the national championship used to be decided by the AP and UPI writers, and they got to list things, 10 points, 9, 8, 7. You had an incentive to misreveal your preferences if you wanted to, you thought it was going to be close between, we said, University of Michigan and Alabama. You'd rank Alabama down, even though you thought they were the second best, you'd rank them down so you made Michigan win. Similarly here, I got an incentive to misreveal and in that first round and vote for something which I really prefer the other, but I know, because I know what the order of the vote's going to be, I'm going to make it so that by misrevealing my preference, I can make my second choice over my third choice when we do that. All right, so we got a problem here. And then what comes along is that Duncan Black what's called Black's theorem. Oops, I think. Oh yeah, my computer is going off here. Flip that. We've already talked about that. This isn't really a phone, right? This is a computer. It's a pretty cruddy phone. If you ever, if you go up to my office and you see the old black telephone that I have, you could hear a lot better with the old black telephone than you can with this thing. But then you can't figure out, if you look up, get on Google and look up Black's theorem, it'll pop up for you, right? So anyway, Duncan Black was looking at this, and I have Black's paper in the folder. He says if the number of voters are odd, if the number of voters are odd, and all preferences are single-peaked, and what we said was, when we were just talking about this a moment ago, when we drew the picture, if all preferences are single-peak, what does that mean? They vote for things which are closer to their most preferred position, that are closer to their most preferred position, if that happens, then that's what we call their single peaked, then majority is transitive. Majority vote will be transitive. And as we already noted, the outcome will be the preference of the median voter. So again, Duncan Black said, Black's theorem, and again, that there's a 1948 article where he discusses this, and it's in your folder. What he showed was, I got a condition, if it satisfies that condition, then the preference of the median voter will determine the outcome, and majority vote is going to be transitive. Now, if we go back to the social welfare function, and if we go back to what the characteristics of the social welfare function, we'll notice that we're really saying that there's going to be some preferences that we just can't handle, right? And we said that was we're going to call that what? Unrestricted domain, right? So under the second characteristic that we had of the social welfare function was unrestricted domain, and so what are we doing? We're getting rid of unrestricted domain, right? Because if somebody doesn't have single peak preferences, then the transitivity is not going to it's not going to be transitive. So you got to give up one or the other. So basically, if what you say is if we're going to have single peaked, right? If that's the only preferences that we have, everybody's preferences are single peaked, then what we have is we've given up that characteristic unrestricted domain. Turns out, though, in 1967, Charles Plott comes along in 1967 and he says, you know what, and again, this paper's in your folder too, American Economic Review paper that Plott did. He said, you know what, if we have more than one dimension to what we're voting on, then it's not going to hold. Okay? If there's more than one issue, then what happens is Black's theorem doesn't hold. That is, even with preferences being single peaked, that is, people will vote for things that are closest to their most preferred state over things which are farther away. Even if you have that, if you have more than one issue, then you can still get intransitivity. And it's a little bit of a complicated diagram, so I already drew it this morning. And again, this diagram is both in the notes in your folder, and it's also in the chapter that I just inserted in the textbook folder of your folder. So let's say how much we're gonna spend on two different goods. We're gonna spend it on national defense, and we're gonna spend it on infrastructure. Okay, so if you think about it, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, we're going to have a third dimension coming out of here if we're going to measure utilities, okay? And so what are we doing here? What we're doing with these pictures is we're basically drawing a topographic map, okay? Every point along here, this is A's most preferred point. So you can think of A's point sticking out here. This is B's most preferred point sticking out here. This is C's most preferred point sticking out there. Then what I do is I could look, just like in a topographic map, right? You have certain elevations. Every point along here, that's a lower utility for A, but those are all the same utility for person A. All these preferences along here are along their indifference curve. They're all the same. Similarly for person B, this is their highest point, and I just drew one topographic point here where all these points are lower utility than they are at this spot B, but these all have the same utility. And things which are closer, right, are basically up the hill, right? So this point here, 2, is preferred to point 1 for person B, right? Because point 2 is inside here, so it's closer to B's B's preference, highest preference point. Okay, so it's like a topographic map. Things that are inside this have higher utility. Things that are along that line have the same utility. And then for person C, we have a similar situation here where this is C's most preferred point, and then these are all points which have equal utility for person C. But point 3, for example, if you just look at this, point 3 is going to be more preferred to C than point 2 because its point 3 is within that within that topographic line there, and so you can think of it as being higher up the hill of the higher up the hill of their utility mountain. Okay, so makes sense here, right? So again, not rocket surgery here. What we got is basically we just got 2 dimensions of 2 different goods, and utility's got to be coming out in a 3rd dimension. And all I'm doing is doing just like a topographic map where this point is the highest point. This is the highest point for B, highest point for C, and then I'm drawing equal utility levels or equal elevations. Those things that are closer to to A's high point, that is, they're within that thing, are going to be have higher utility. Now we're going to vote on, if we're voting on 1 against 2, right? So we're voting on point 1 against point 2, how much you're going to spend. So A, if you look at A is going to prefer 1 to 2, right? Because 1 is inside A's topographic points here, inside that utility. So 1 is closer to A's in terms of utility. 1 is closer than 2 for A, so A is going to vote for 1. But for B and C, it's the opposite. That is, if you look at B, 2 is inside B's topographic points here. 1 is on the edge of it, so 2 must be at a higher point than 1 is for B. And then for C, you have a similar situation in that if we have 2 is over here, it's on C's equal utility point, and 1 is farther away. Okay? So we're going to have B and C are going to prefer 2 to 1. Now if we do 3 against 2, if we do 3 against 2, what's going to happen? A and C are both going to vote for 3. If you look at 3 against 2, right, 2 is farther away for C than 3 is. And if we look at A, we've got 3 is on A's border and 2 is outside of A's border. So A and C are going to vote for 3. B is going to vote for 2 because it's closer there. So if we were to be, if we were to have a transitivity, we would, what do we got? We have that 2 is preferred to 1, 3 is preferred to 2, and so we ought to have is that this is our problem here. If we vote 1 against 2, then what's going to happen is, did I do that? What did I got here? Yeah. So if we're going to 3 against 1, if we go 3 against 1, what do I have? This is really that way. So if I have 3 against 1, then what's going to happen is I'm going to have both A and B are going to prefer 1, and then what's going to happen is C is going to prefer 3, and so 1 is preferred to 3, right? So now I got an intransitivity. So that was just an interesting point that Black's theorem doesn't hold if you're talking about, if I've got a bill that has a, well, let's look at the appropriations bill, all right, in the United States Congress. The way the United States Congress is supposed to work is you're supposed to have, what, 12 appropriations bills, each one for a different, one's for defense, one's for Department of Health and Human Services, et cetera, but they never do that, right? What do you end up with? You end up with a consolidated bill, and it's, 3 3,000 pages long, and Congress votes for it, right? So there's lots and lots of issues going on. Just think of what President Biden is trying to get with the $3.5 trillion infrastructure bill, right? There's more than one issue there, right? There's lots and lots of issues. What does that mean? If you're going to do it by majority vote, it could be intransitive, right? And guess what? They're going to do it by majority vote, right? That's sort of the deal that's going on. They're not going to filibuster it, right? So that is a if you were on the Senate floor, you could stand up and say, well, gee, if you guys had read Charlie Plott, you'd know that this is going to be an intransitivity here, or it could be intransitive. Even if people's preferences are single peak, it could still be intransitive. And so maybe we ought to just look at one thing at a time, right? Maybe we should just vote on this thing, then vote on this thing, vote on this thing, okay? That's not going to happen, guarantee you. I mean, first of all, they're not even going to have read the bill, right? There's not going to be one person on that Senate floor that's read the whole bill, right? There's not going to be one person on the House floor that's read the whole bill. Because why? Because they're rationally ignorant in this thing, right? But from a public choice perspective, at least you guys know that, right? And that's what we're talking about here. All right. All right. So that concludes our section on majority vote in cycling. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to move into something that is related in that where do parties put themselves, right? If you had, if you just gone over what we just went over, you'd say, wow, the preference of the median voter is what's going to determine the outcome, right? So maybe what I ought to do is if I'm the Democrats, I ought to align myself with what? The preferences of the median voter, right? So we're going to get that same story here. That is, we noted that if we're voting on an issue, the preferences of the median voter is going to determine the outcome, and we have that the legislators are voting on how much to spend. As what will happen is the preference of the median legislator will determine what the outcome is. We noticed that you can get cycling if you don't have single peak preferences and you're only voting on one issue at a time. And we also noted that if you have a multidimensional issue space, then you can get cycling. So now the issue is, rather than individuals voting like on a committee or in the Congress, now we're going to do is we're going to look at what about political parties? What's their strategy? And again, if you are the Democrats, and when you were looking for the in the 2020 election, do you want to align yourself with Bernie Sanders, or do you want to align yourself with Joe Biden? Joe Biden has sort of moved towards Bernie Sanders after the election, but when they were campaigning, right, they were in different spots basically in the issue space. Now, this goes back to a paper in 1929 by Hotelling, which is a famous paper. Again, Hotelling's paper is called The Stability of Competition. And this is in your folder as well, right? Of stability in competition. So again, this is in your folder. If you want to go ahead and read Hotelling's paper, just people do stuff like that, right? They read Aristotle, right? Yeah. How many have had a class where you read Cicero, right? So, I'm not going to ask you to read Hotelling's paper, but you know, maybe you want to go, some people want to go read Cicero, other people might want to read Hotelling, right? So anyway, Hotelling wrote a famous paper in 1929. Oh, so looks like we're done here. So what we'll do for Monday, we're going to start basically the next section. So go ahead and look at the next section. I think it's Holcomb chapter 2 maybe. Is that the next thing? And then, like I said, take a look. I just put in the folder the new chapter, which again might have some typos or stuff in it. But go ahead and take a look at that for Monday.